Many years ago, uh, Wayne Oates spoke on a program that we at the Christian Life Commission sponsored. John Wood introduced him, and he said, actually, all of you know who Wayne Oates is, and none of you know who I am. Perhaps he should be introducing me. And that's how I feel introducing Paul. You all know Paul. He was my longtime fellow pastor in Georgia as he served at the First Baptist Church of Athens for how many years, Paul?
9 years.
9 years at First Baptist Athens, and he has, I think, fortuitously come to his role as our leader in CBF, and he has kindly agreed to speak to us today and dialogue with us about CBF as it stands in the current environment, and perhaps a bit about his vision for what happens as the future unfolds. And with that, I'm going to trust the knowledge and esteem of this group for Paul and just pass it off to you, my brother. Thanks for coming and making time to be with us today.
Well, David, thank you for the invitation. It is good to be with each of you. I think among those of us in the room, I probably have the longest history with Chuck Bugg because we both served together at Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond when he was teaching preaching and when I was on staff there. I was also a student in the D-Min program, and I don't know if Chuck wants to claim any responsibility for the way I preach, but Chuck is the person who once told me that I was a really lousy manuscript preacher and I need to find a different way to preach. He said it much nicer than that because Chuck emanates the fruit of the Spirit in ways that not all of us Baptists always do. But I've been working out the challenge of that statement as a preacher ever since. And so, Chuck, it's good to be with you again. So as I thought about today, what I'd like to do is you asked me to speak, and so I do want to share some things with you, but I want to err on the side of presenting less so that we can dialogue more. Because if you come to this conversation with a leader of a Baptist denomination in 2025, and you each bring long histories in the Baptist world that created CBF, there are probably questions you'd like to ask, or at least things you would like to have some response to. And I want to make sure that we protect most of our time to steward what interests you most. And so you won't be surprised to know I do think a lot about what makes CBF unique in this moment, especially. I'm starting my 7th year in this job. I was called to this role in January of 2019. I started full-time in March of 2019 and marked my first anniversary with the start of the COVID pandemic. So the first year of the 6 that I have finished went about like I expected, and it's all been what I hope most days is holy improvisation ever since. Because the world has changed and the church is changing. But something that was said to me after my election was announced, before I started work, someone who knows a lot about American denominational life said, I don't think Cooperative Baptist Fellowship people really understand how unique Cooperative Baptist Fellowship congregations are. And this was a statement made in 2019 by someone who knew our community but was not employed by it. He said that his experience of CBF congregations was that we tended to be more politically and theologically diverse. That was to say, most of our congregations were some shade of purple in a world that was increasingly red or blue. And he even observed that there were other purple denominations. His example was the United Methodist Church at the time. But he said most Methodist congregations in their own identity are either blue are red. They come together to form a purple denomination, which is probably less purple today than it was then because of the schism the Methodist Church has gone through. But his comment rested in me and has rested in me more and more as I've watched our congregations and their leaders navigate a pulverizing and paralyzing partisan environment. It's a very different thing to do ministry in a polarizing age when your congregation is itself diverse than when you have a congregation that has a settled political identity in a world that is diverse. So the art of being a pastor of that kind of congregation is one of the most difficult, challenging, important, remarkable leadership challenges that exists. I said at the General Assembly last summer that it's not just that our congregations still are quite diverse politically and theologically. Our fellowship is becoming more diverse at a moment when our culture is becoming less and less appreciative of that diversity. And that was before this week. So, our fellowship is growing racially, ethnically, generationally, geographically, in a world where that kind of diversity is less and less common. I can only see that as a challenging act of God, because we so-called moderate Baptists have never been artful practitioners of conspiracy or engineering. So if we are in fact becoming more diverse in a world that is becoming more polarized, that has to in some measure be an act of God, and it also is incredibly challenging. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the question, how do we support and equip congregations and their leaders? And what unique kind of witness do our congregations have to offer in this moment? And what opportunity do we have to be an embodiment of an authentically Baptist, unmistakably Christian approach to difference in a world where such a thing is desperately needed? So when I think about where CBF is right now, that line of questioning is very prominent in my thinking. It reflects some core commitments I bring to what it means to be a Baptist denomination that I think were really navigated well by those who were involved in the founding of CBF. So like one of the earliest debates on the way to CBF being created is, what would we call ourselves? Some of you were in the room for those debates. I was studying for exams at Wake Forest, so I have an alibi. But the debate was, are we going to call ourselves a convention? Or are we going to call ourselves a union? You all will be stunned to know, being learned Baptists, that I've heard 5 different stories for how we got the name Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, which sounds about right because we have 4 gospels, right? So there are different people who were in the room where that happened who have different memories about who had what idea when. But the group landed on the word fellowship to describe what we would be. And we've spent a lot of time, I think, unnecessarily apologizing for that word, but I think it's actually the right choice, that it's become more and more correct with time. But we have to set aside a devaluing of the word fellowship. Because, in our Baptist parlance, too often fellowship is what happens around the most important things. Like we go to worship in the sanctuary and then we eat chicken in the fellowship hall. But we might forget that the word that the New Testament translates partnership in Philippians and fellowship in 1 John is the word koinonia, which is used to describe both the inner life of the Trinity and the quality of life that should distinguish the Christian community. A life rooted in love and sacrifice and transformation. I think a Baptist denominational community that embodied those qualities would be exactly the kind of witness the world needs right now. More than any union or any convention. I also have this crazy idea that in a genuinely Baptist polity, the denomination exists to serve and strengthen the congregations, not that congregations exist to prop up denominations. So I was taught growing up that in a Baptist polity, the local congregation under the leadership of the Holy Spirit was the highest authority. And then they formed other associations, conventions, unions, fellowships to support their ministry. It'd be hard to prove that with a lot of Baptist models today. But I think CBF exists as a community to strengthen congregations, help them form their next generations of leaders, and connect them to the mission of Jesus around the world in ways that no congregation can be engaged in on their own. So when I think about what we should be paying attention to at the denominational level, it's how do we organize our resources and relationships to strengthen congregations and their leaders? How do we tend to the noticing, naming, and nurturing of women and men who are being called to be leaders of congregations in the future? And how do we offer our congregations ways of joining Christ in mission all around the world? Congregational vitality, leadership formation, global mission. I think those are three things a genuinely Baptist denominational community focused on congregation can pay attention to. Sometimes people ask me, so David mentioned, I was pastor of a really good congregation until 2019. And a question I was often asked when I accepted this call is, why in the world would you leave pastoring a good congregation that will put up with your idiosyncrasies to go work for a denomination in a post-denominational moment? It's a good question. It's polite for, have you lost your mind? I do believe that the world has more than enough top-down, power-hungry, abusive, controlling denominations. And I think time is against them, although it doesn't always look like it. But I think what there is a need for, a desperate need for, is an honest Baptist denominational community with a focus on strengthening congregations, forming leaders, and engaging mission. So that's why I think we were called to exist. That's what I spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to live into. The only other thing I want to make sure I say before I ask you the question, what do you really want to talk about this afternoon? Because I am a recovering Baptist pastor. I could talk for the next 30 minutes, take a question, and pronounce the benediction. But I'm going to demonstrate a miracle. Chuck taught me to preach less than 20 minutes. I want you to notice the clock, Chuck. Don't always follow your instructions, but since you're here, I'm gonna. You probably saw the most recent news in the CBF world is that 13 of our global missions field personnel accepted an offer from us to take an early retirement. And since you are all vested leaders in the Baptist world, I want to speak to that for just a minute, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you have. But I wouldn't want to be with you and not speak a little bit about what was behind that decision. If you want to know more, you can ask any question you want. The decision to invite all of our field personnel age 60 and above to consider an early retirement offer was made carefully under the authorization of our governing board, partly to respond to a persistent problem in CBF life, and partly to really well steward an unexpected opportunity. So the persistent problem was, as you know, CBF inherited from the Baptist world we came out of an annual offering for missions. Actually, we inherited 2 and we converted it to 1, which you can promote as many times a year as you'd like to. If you'd like to promote it more than twice, we don't object to that either. But in CBF life for the last 10 years, all the revenue from that offering has been used to support the salaries, benefits, housing, and childhood educational costs for our field personnel who serve in the United States and on 3 other continents around the world. The good news is over the last 4 years, in a time of great instability, that offering has not been in decline. It has been stable to sometimes very modestly strengthened. It has lived consistently between $2.6 and $2.8 million a year. The problem is the cost associated with supporting our core of field personnel as of even as of today, is closer to $3.6 million a year. The offering has not met its goal in more than a decade. And so several generations of CBF executive coordinators, missions coordinators, and governance bodies have chosen, I think for good reason, to take a wait and see attitude about this. Would the offering lift? Would other things happen? Nobody wanted to make a decision in the midst of a pandemic or a huge recession. You didn't want to make a decision with long-term consequences just based on short-term realities. But the decision to wait and see and be patient meant that we were constantly having to absorb a gap about that size. That meant drawing from reserves, and it meant, frankly, holding back other priorities. The decision we were just starting to grapple with was, we can't keep doing this forever. We were not yet in a place of emergency. I don't think you make good decisions in a place of emergency. But it was clear we could not keep on keeping on. At the moment that happened, we were starting to process that, the fellowship received an unexpected, substantial, unrestricted estate gift. And we were trying to prayerfully consider how to steward that gift. And we remember that over the last several years in various engagements with our global missions field personnel, we heard several that were approaching retirement say they felt like they were starting to feel a call to retirement, but they were financially anxious. Because here's a news flash: denominations don't historically pay missionaries well. So you can give your life serving for decades and be not in an ideal position financially as you think about retirement. And so the intersection of that pattern of where the offering was, the financial concerns of some of our field personnel closest to retirement, and the provision of unexpected resources caused us to say, why don't we at least give our field personnel closest to retirement the opportunity to make a decision about a meaningful offer? And our goal in building the offer was that they would experience it to be meaningful and generous and not just passing an institutional burden. The field personnel who received it to a person unsolicited used language that conveyed they believed that we had met our goals, that the offer was meaningful to them. They experienced it as generous. They were all told that they were free to say yes to the offer or free to say yes to continued full-time ministry. And that they had earned the right to own their own decision. 13 chose to say yes to the early retirement. Some will continue serving in ministry in more part. Think of what we do when we retire from full-time pastoral ministry and become interims. Some will be doing the equivalent in the missions world. Some will be stepping back entirely. But as a result of the 13 decisions to retire, we will face our next budget process and the future of CBF Global Missions in an undeniably sustainable financial place for the first time in more than a decade. We will not be rushing to commission new people for several reasons. One, we made some real progress in the last several years on how we compensate field personnel. We have more progress to make for the folks we still have. Number two, a transition like this gives us a rare opportunity to ask questions we've not been able to ask since CBF Global Missions was founded about how we make decisions about where we send, what kind of team and supervisory structure is most conducive to field personnel flourishing in their ministries for the long haul. Lara Ayala, who's our coordinator of global missions, and I stood up a task force of field personnel last summer and empowered them to explore those questions. We're expecting their recommendations by General Assembly this year. We need to be able to receive and implement those recommendations before we even think about new positions. So we're not going to be in a rush to create a photo op. We're going to support the ministries that remain as fully as we can. And we're going to ask the right kind of transitional questions. And the other thing we're going to be paying more and more attention to is how do we cultivate a pipeline for the kind of field personnel that are required for the future of the global mission? So closer partnerships with congregations, closer partnerships with undergraduate institutions, different partnerships with theological schools to make sure that we are beginning relationships with those who might be called to global mission earlier and more proactively. We've not properly invested in what you might describe as pipeline cultivation in more than a few minutes. Because when you're a place of financial anxiety, you don't pay attention to those things. So we need to pay attention to those things before we do anything else. So I want to speak from a vision and theology perspective. I wanted to speak to the latest news we made. And I wanted to then stop and ask you, y'all invited me, what do you really want to talk more about? Or what would you like to know more about, whether it relates to what I've shared or it relates to questions you want to ask about other things? And I'm going to pause and see what you want to push on or ask about.
Paul, you mentioned that giving to global missions was stable. What about membership in CBF churches? Do you have any statistics to indicate, are they growing? Are they about the same? Or are they facing what we are at Central Baptist in Daytona, a continuing loss of membership due to aging?
So in a Zoom room where there are academics present, I want to be very transparent about how I answer this question. One of the results of CBF being founded as a protest movement out of the Southern Baptist Convention is our churches have never been eager to turn over data about themselves. So early in my ministry in North Carolina, I had to fill out the annual church letter, which would allow a denomination to answer your kind of question with actual data. There are no annual church letters in the CBF world. So everything we know is anecdotal. So we tried to learn a whole lot more about what we pay attention to when we visit churches. When I was hired, I thought I was going to visit churches to represent CBF, but now I understand that while I do that, what's even more important, when I visit a church, I learn something about CBF. And when my colleagues visit a church and our state and regional coordinators visit churches, we learn about CBF. So what I can tell you based on experience and anecdotal evidence is so there is good news. Within the CBF world, there are congregations that are growing. There are congregations that are thriving. There are congregations that are healthy, and those are in big cities and in small towns. And they are more progressive and more traditional theologically. And they worship in robes and they worship in jeans and t-shirts. And they worship in suits. So like there are healthy, growing churches, really coming out of the COVID pandemic. There was a freedom to set some things aside, ask some new questions. So there are those demonstrations of hope, I would call them. There are also congregations who are really struggling. And so part of what we have to struggle with is how much of our time do we spend trying to further strengthen the ones who are growing stronger, and what can we do to help the congregations that are more in a crisis state? And all those congregations are struggling to navigate the fact that they are more diverse than most of their peers by some measure or another, and sometimes by multiple measures. So, yes, there are growing congregations. And yes, there are new congregations coming to CBF. We're starting to reap the benefits of 4 years of work of a new team we created at the height of the pandemic called our Outreach and Growth Team. We're welcoming congregations from different parts of the country, different racial and ethnic backgrounds to CBF life. That is remaking our community in some really beautiful ways. So yes, there are signs of growth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Who else? Chuck.
Oh, Paul, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're coming through loud and clear.
Okay. Well, number one, I'm glad you scrapped the manuscript. You have a lot of dynamism in what you're doing. So
Well, I'm glad you still stand by that decision, because otherwise we'd have a problem. Yeah.
Well, I always think about when I first knew you, you were in the basement of BTSR, and now you've gone to the penthouse. So I've watched your move. So seriously appreciate what you're doing and your leadership. Let me go back to an issue you mentioned about something. I think one of the second things you raised was about mentoring.
Yes.
Helping to develop, particularly pastors for churches. Of course, I've been elated that we have a number of women now who are filling our pulpits, which is a great help. But let me take my church in Georgetown, Kentucky. Our pastor just resigned without a place to go.
Yes.
And so, you know, I look at this and I think to myself, obviously as a retired pastor, what I don't want to do is to invade somebody's territory or to be offering advice that's not wanted. I mean, I think that's the worst thing to do. At the same time, if we have churches that are struggling, is there a way to deploy some of us who are not able to be maybe as active in some of the things, but maybe you'd be an encouragement? You know, I've talked with Bob Fox about this in Kentucky, but in some ways, you know, I feel like you're at certain points, you're put on the shelf. And obviously I have no desire to take any kind of leadership role, but you know, I whatever years I have left, I would like to spend in being helpful. And I just watched it. I watched this situation just develop, and a young minister resigning without a place to go. And I'm thinking to myself, what could we have done? How could we have interceded to help in this situation? I know you probably work through primarily divinity schools and seminaries in developing this, but what about deploying some of us who don't have a lot of overhead financially for the CBF that may be of some help? Has that ever been considered?
So it's something that I'm thinking a lot about right now. So I know a little bit about what's happened at Faith Georgetown.
Mm.
I share concern about it. Um, um, there have been several cases over the last several months where relatively young pastors resigned suddenly. And some of it is kind of I think some of it's a delayed working out of the stress of leading churches during and beyond the pandemic. And
Right.
there was a lot of
Right.
documentation of the so-called Great Resignation back there. Some of it is a reflection that, so Chuck, when you and I first met, I was running a Lilly-funded program for BTSR that was, designed to help prepare for a time when we would have a lot more open churches than we had candidates. And
Right.
one of the leading edges of the decline in clergy supply is that people have been called to more and more challenging places earlier and earlier in their ministries before they've built the networks of support or frankly the life experience to manage certain kinds of situations. And they don't always know how to ask for help. So that's one stiff headwind. Like the clergy supply, the market issues for clergy mean there are fewer folks to go around and people get put in more challenging situations faster. Another related challenge, so you mentioned seminaries. You may or may not be aware, but I see representatives in this call who have connections to several of the relatively new CBF partner schools. CBF partner schools, like almost all the theological schools, are negotiating all kinds of challenges themselves. And now the greatest majority of theological degrees are being administered entirely or primarily online.
Right. Right.
Which means the role of seminaries has changed. And I've started describing that as ATS that has no connection to local congregations or to denominations made a series of decisions that creates a whole bunch of new work for denominations and congregations. They didn't check with us. They didn't have to. So now the question is, if people are doing an MDiv work primarily in a single congregation online, how do we get them a community of support while they're in seminary? And if people are then being called out of seminary earlier and earlier into more and more challenging kinds of contexts, because also the world is becoming more challenging, what kind of intervention do we provide relationally? What kind of coaching and support can a denomination provide those pastors? And I think we'll have to leverage every resource we have, including retired pastors, including presently serving pastors who have a care for the larger church, including lay people in congregations who know things about organizational leadership and mental health and well-being, because the risk of pastoral isolation is higher now than it's ever been. And for 20 years, it's been a crisis. So you taught preaching, Chuck. Wade taught pastoral care. And so I am not the best qualified person in the Zoom room to talk about the dangers of isolation to well-being or health. And so we've got to surround pastors like the one who left your church with a much more robust network of support and encouragement. And frankly, it's not a word we use a lot, but also healthy kinds of accountability. Because leaving with nowhere to go is not good for the church or the pastor.
Right.
So, yeah, I'm very interested about how we leverage all the resources at our disposal to make sure that relatively new career pastors, especially, have access to what they need. And seminaries are less prepared than they've ever been to help with that. So we all have to step up with less resources.
I mean, and I'll just end with it. Is there somebody, Paul, at Global CBF who could, help to build a network of retired ministers, or as you say, ministers who are doing well in churches, who would be willing to be, because, you know, I don't feel a sense of network, and that may just be my fault for not taking the initiative to contact somebody, but I would know whom to contact at Global CBF.
That is an opportunity that I can gladly share with somebody. So I do think it's part of our responsibility to work with our state regional coordinators to make sure that we are in. One of the words we use to describe our work is inviting. So we need to be able to invite people to serve in ways that equip people for ministry and transform congregations and communities. And so I'll take this to our congregational ministries team, because I think you're right. And it relates to other conversations we're already having.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening to that.
Thank you for the offer and the testimony. As we all know, sometimes our experience forms our best insights. And what you all have just lived through, I think, would make thoughtful leaders ask these kind of really important questions. And everything we used to assume about the support networks people would come out of seminary with is no longer true.
Mm-hmm.
It's more needed than ever.
Right. Well, thank you for your good response, Paul. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Who else has a question, an appeal, a challenge?
Well, I have a thought. Thank you for sharing with us today and for your inspiration. I have a thought about possible issues around the isolation, and it comes from a couple of things. One, we are in a generation that has grown up on media.
Yes.
That has grown up talking to their friends on Facebook, and there's, in my experience, more of the young adults, 20 to 30 years old, in seminary, and I'm currently still doing parish CPE with 7 or 8 students 3 times a year. The ones in seminary lack those skills of face-to-face interaction, but relate with joy on a screen. And I think we're experiencing a mindset shift there.
Yes.
In dealing with the isolation in the pandemic, I was teaching some online for BSK, and so I switched my entire CPE program online on Zoom. They spend 8 hours a day with me on Zoom, and we added a requirement. I pair them in diverse pairs, and they must spend an hour a week on FaceTime, phone, Zoom, or something with their new partner.
Wow.
And they can talk about the class, they can talk about ministry stress, about whatever personal issues they want to talk about. They can journal that and bring it to me if they will. My shock and surprise in this is the durability of those relationships, the depth of those relationships, and the sustainability. An example, I have an Episcopal minister in Appalachia who's developed a weekly friendship that's lasted 18 months now after the class was over.
Wow.
A Catholic priest in India. And they, I had a pastor of a small rural Indiana church and a Catholic priest from Cameroon begin to call each other brother. And these friendships continue to blossom, and they share things over Zoom they wouldn't share in person.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to nurture partnerships where their safety in the person being in another country, another state, another denomination. I'm wondering if some way every CBF pastor could have a peer partner someplace else.
and that could simply be a part of what they do. And these mentors, like Chuck is volunteering to be, could be on call or could each be in charge of 6 or so of those who would kind of just have a fellowship time once a week. But I have a vision of something happening like that. This has been, it's not a requirement of CPE that they have a peer partnership. It's something we did in COVID to help deal with isolation.
Wow. No, I'm not surprised to hear you express surprise at the durability of those relationships, because I think a lot of us who had more traditional backgrounds assumed that relationships that had not been forged in person might not last. You know, I'm preaching Sunday in a church in Florida, actually, outside Tallahassee, on the parable of the sower. And you talk about the seed that didn't make it because it had no depth of soil. And I think I would certainly have carried a bias that in-person foundation is part of depth of soil. But
I certainly agree with that. And sometimes these peer partnerships that have developed,
yes,
a Louisville Presbyterian young pastor in Western Kentucky
yep,
drove 200 miles to Campbellsville for an event at the Catholic Church. It was honoring her peer partner who was the priest down there.
oh wow,
A young Disciples of Christ Hispanic pastor here in Louisville drove north of Indianapolis to surprise her peer partner when her peer partner was preaching one Sunday. And the in-person, the testimony about the in-person finally meeting joy and embracing would validate what you've said and what I deeply believe, that will never replace the in-person.
yeah. So I still hold that too, Wade. But I also know, I mean, I still got teenage kids at home. I also know we're just beginning to learn about both the opportunities and dangers of the so-called I generation. You know, a generation that was formed digitally. But there's no doubt that people 10 and more years younger than me are more open to virtual and more open to that as a primary. But something else you said that I want to pick up on is, I think there is a benefit to cultivating friendship or partnership outside our primary network. So like, I've been in peer learning groups. Like I was one at First Baptist Athens. We had another CBF church in Athens. There were 2 others from very nearby towns. And because members of our churches sometimes moved among our churches because they got mad at one of us, or because they had relatives, sometimes people had to be cautious about what they would say. Which meant, although the space was familiar, it was differently unsafe. And one of the things a totally new, unlikely friend might bring, if it's especially outside our denomination or at least outside our locale, is there's less of a certain kind of risk. But I do think there's value in connecting practitioners for conversation about what they're experiencing in real time right now. And so no, I'm really interested in how, because the other thing I've noticed is their generation of pastors. So I'm 55, 10, 15 years younger than me, who came out of the kind of the early days of the CBF partner schools. They didn't come out of they weren't part of the last graduates of Southern and Southwestern. They're from the first half of the lives of McAfee, BTSR, BSK, Truett, wherever. Some of them have really strong, deep friendships among others who graduate from their school about the same time. But that has become, for some of those groups, an unintentional echo chamber. If you're only always talking to the same 4 people you've only always talked to, you might get a lot of reinforcement, but no helpful challenge.
Great point.
So I think we need those lifelong, really holy, absolutely trusted friends, but we need the gift of new kinship. And as our fellowship, so an opportunity we have now that we haven't leveraged yet, and your question is making me think about this, is as our fellowship is growing geographically, racially, ethnically, generationally, we have a lot more resources to bring to trying to architect a network of that kind of relationship. So Wade, I think that's a really worthy, holy vision that goes beyond a peer learning group or the friends I met years ago. That could combat isolation, but also expose people to the gift of different thought. I mean, so in leading CBF, I've been intentional about building out a leadership team around me where people come from different backgrounds and different generations and different worldviews, because I figured out pretty early on that this job was bigger than my brain. And sometimes those create really challenging conversations for me, but they help me see things I would otherwise be blind to. And what you're describing would also give pastors access to those kinds of challenging, unlikely friendships.
You know, your talking reminded me of something I hadn't put in this context, and that's when Les Holland was our pastor. Once a year, we would have a fellowship dinner, and all the new members who joined were paired with an existing member at the dinner table.
Yes.
I have a friend of 35 years that I met like that when she and her husband joined St. Matthew's Baptist Church.
That's
They were
remarkable.
different. We didn't know them. And we agreed that we would meet that night, and we would meet at least 5 other times, and then it would be over. But it wasn't over for us. And I'm wondering if maybe some way of just the new congregations coming in, the existing congregation, maybe some, Chuck and some people, there could be some intentional pairing.
Yes.
So that they have this support, the strengthening leaders, strengthening congregation, and building mission is at the heart of what I tell our CPE and the parish students we're doing. We're strengthening them as a self. We want to help them develop care groups and caring preaching, as Chuck Bugg used to teach, and caring leadership, as Bob Johnson taught. We want them to do this in the congregation, and then we want them to have their church on a mission, because a church serving itself, in my opinion, is going to die. And I think around those 3 themes, new members and existing persons could have some type of something the CBF, maybe even at the national meeting. You have a banquet, they meet at the table and they agree to meet on FaceTime or something 4 or 5 times and see where it goes.
Yeah, so our outreach and growth team has worked at a concept level on what they call a companion congregation model. So when a congregation comes new into CBF, whether it's an established congregation or a church start or whatever, they would be intentionally paired with a congregation that's been in the network longer to help them make connections, and kind of like Les did at St. Matthew's. Newcomers come to your church, you assign them kind of a mentor or a relationship. It's the same kind of concept. It's not rolled out yet, but but it exists.
It would be for congregations. I'm thinking
it would
for
be
individuals, because for the servant leaders themselves.
Yes.
But yes, anyway, I think that might speak to that. A book that I have found helpful and I use with my students now, and this is self-serving, I've mentioned it before. My nephew, who left Southern Baptist and CBF and is an American Baptist at First Baptist Church, Lawrence, Kansas.
Yes.
Sturdivant wrote a book from mistrust to trust. He co-authored that book, and it is leading purple congregations in dialogue and their case studies around confronting the gay issue. which is something we've done at St. Matthew's. We lost some members, but we're
Yep.
stronger and richer because of it.
Mm.
And I have found that openly addressing stances toward conflict is an often missed piece of our training. We don't teach people to fight.
No.
Fair, honestly. And I wish Larry McSwain were here. He's done that with congregations for a year. I know David Sapp has done some work around that, but I think we need some resources out of CBF that would prepare congregations of how to deal with conflict and how to fight fair. Fight like Christians, don't fight like politicians. I don't know what to call it.
Yeah.
David Sapp, do you have any resources for us on that?
No, not really. Larry's a good one, but my experience with church conflict is frontline experience primarily.
Yes.
And that's, wow, I could talk from now till Sunday about what I learned in a few years at Second Ponce, but I didn't find a lot of very helpful materials. I had a church member when we were in the midst of a lot of conflict who gave me a book to read, and I read about half of it. I was pretty distressed emotionally at the time, and basically the book was you could sum it up by everything this guy said was, it's the pastor's fault. He didn't put it that way, and he wouldn't have thought of it that way, but it was basically, well, the pastor could have done this differently and that differently and the other thing differently. And I think a thing that I learned is that my own arrogance was my enemy, because I thought before I got in the midst of major church conflicts that only people who were not as smart as I was and who didn't handle it as well as I did, they were the only ones who really got in trouble.
Yeah.
And I discovered that anybody can land in those situations, and negotiating them is something that almost nobody talks about. I did have, and pardon me for going off on a tangent, but I had a remarkable experience at one of the very worst moments in the whole thing, when people were trying to fire me. I got a call one day from a guy who said, you don't know me. You've never heard of me. I'm pastor of a little small town church in Texas, but I know what's going on in your church. And I just wanted to tell you that a couple of years ago, I had a similar experience in my church, and I have survived. And here's what I learned. And you're going to survive too. And I was like, wow, the power of that.
Yes.
Somebody who just out of the blue calls and offers support is an amazing, it's just an amazing power to that. So I guess back to the mentoring kind of idea that Chuck was talking about, that's about the most valuable resource I found, is the support that you got from people who knew and cared about you.
Yeah.
And by the way, if I might offer this as well, in my time, which has now been 25 years ago, but in my time of dealing with that, the power of friends and colleagues was extraordinary, but it was also extraordinarily surprising that some friends and colleagues didn't know what to do with you.
Yep.
And kept their distance. And I don't think it was really judgmental or hostile. It was, I I just don't know what to do with you.
Mhm.
And be that as it may, I have tried to make it my mission since then, when I've known of pastors who were in tough conflict situations. I try to call them or make some kind of contact. And in my mind, I'm passing on what that Texas pastor did for me.
Mm.
Mhm. Mhm.
No, that's beautiful. Listening to y'all talk. One of the things we are exploring in the back room right now is what is CBF's role in resourcing congregational clergy and lay leaders around difficult conversation, polarization. Historically, denominations have been reluctant to do actual conflict intervention once it erupts. And the unholy self-interest around that is, even if you do it really well, a group in a congregation decides to blame you for their conflict. And so denominational types are usually reluctant to be once the conflict really blows up, denominations are usually reluctant to intervene. But what denominations have not done, and what we have not done yet, is any kind of baseline resourcing or preventative messaging. So what that does is, I think, is it lays congregations and leaders even more at risk for the worst kinds of conflict. So like David's testimony, I mean, I think we all want to believe that if we do our jobs well, we won't be in that place. That's demonstrably false, and it's dangerous. It's going to happen to all of us sooner or later if we stay around long enough. So what are the ways of thinking, feeling, and acting when it comes to conflict and disagreement and tension that are faithful? What habits should we be nurturing in congregational leadership teams in all seasons that equip them to handle conflict? And how is that different from Capitol Hill? And I think there is a lane for a denomination to do that kind of preventative, general, reflective intervention. I don't think there's any danger of denominations taking church consultants out of the conflict business, because no denomination also has enough staff. Even if we were not conflict resistant in terms of when you get caught in the middle of a conflict, we don't have enough staff to unleash people to spend 6 months to a year deeply immersed in a congregation the way consultants do. But what we can do is generalized resourcing around the basic ideas. We can work against the destructive myths about it. And we can work to encourage, at the intersection of David's testimony, what Chuck has said, and what you said, a network of support reaching out, so that a pastor from Texas who called it just the right time for David, and David, who's been intentionally calling it just the right time for other colleagues, are not exceptions. If we could get rid of the myth that if you do your job well, you won't have conflict, then I think the distance David was talking about would be less likely. Because at a time pastors most need the best kind of peer support, the isolation of the stigma of I don't know how to respond to you is particularly crippling.
Paul, that makes a lot of sense. And a thought that just ran through my mind was, as I read the CBF material that comes out every month, and I maybe simply have a brief testimony in there about how I lost, or how I, where I failed, or how I fought. And David Sapp tells that story, and Chuck tells a story.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to hear you say that we think we're not going to have people against us. I was fortunate enough in my first church in Lakeland, Florida. I was an associate with T.
Yeah.
Reed Coleman, and the vice president of Publix Food Company was in
Yeah.
our church. I'd been there maybe 3 months when Bill intimidatedly said, "I want an appointment with you." The vice president, he comes in. He's also chair of the deacons.
Yeah.
And he said, "Who's mad at you, Wade?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well," he said, "you're doing a lot of good things in this church with the youth, and you don't do something like that without making enemies. Conflict's just a part of ministry."
Yeah.
He said, "That's part of my role over at Publix, is helping people realize we have to face that stuff."
Yep.
And I said, "Well, there are some people upset with our doing this coffee shop and doing some things different than what we've been doing." And he said, "I've heard about it. Would you mind if I speak to them?" And so
Yeah.
I've just kind of embraced conflict as a reality of any organization.
Yeah.
And if we're going to function, we have to have a stance, a theology, and a practice of approaching conflict.
I agree. I was laughing because so Chuck and I once had a colleague you've all heard of named Cecil Sherman. And Cecil used to famously say, by the way, I so wish I had the video recordings of Cecil and Dan Bagby trying to teach a class together, because I could have raised the gap in the offering of global missions with those videos. And Chuck knows what I'm talking about, but he promised not to talk, I think. But like Cecil used to say in those kind of settings, if you have a 100% approval rating, you're not doing anything.
Mm-hmm.
And he was very testimonial in sharing his stories of conflict around all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And so, my childhood pastor was Warren Carr, who pastored Watt Street Baptist in Durham at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and then took a semi-retirement gig at Wake Forest Baptist Church when I was a kid. But he spoke very openly about the inevitability of certain kinds of conflict. But I don't think that's been the norm. And I don't think we have prepared leaders well, be they pastors or lay leaders, by not providing a theological framework and a leadership praxis around conflict. And I think, there is a role for a denomination in that. Amen. It may not be the level 5 conflict intervention, but if we were doing our job better, there might not be as much need for it.
Creating attitudes and pictures and stories and testimonials. Like I love what David
yes
said.
It's very powerful.
Just having a little place where that can come out on a regular basis.
This is not about conflict, but I cannot resist giving you all my favorite Cecil Shermanism. He was my predecessor at First Baptist Chamblee, which a lot of people don't know, but 20 years before me, Cecil had been pastor there. And we had him back to speak at a deacon banquet, and he stood up, and his opening words were, "The trouble with pastors is we're called on to speak more often than we have anything to say."
Mm-hmm.
I've remembered that a lot of times when I felt empty going to a speaking engagement.
Wow. Yeah.
The thing, just one other observation about the conflict thing is, I think ministry tends to attract a kind of who is especially conflict averse. Not everybody is to a degree, but we're pleasers.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to go there. We don't want to do that conflict thing. And that was an issue I certainly had to deal with in a pretty major way. It's like, how can I be in the middle of conflict?
I'm a peacemaker. Yeah,
exactly. But we live in a day when we live in a conflict-laden environment.
Yes.
And that's where our pastors are trying to function.
Yes. And that's not changing.
No.
Am I on here? Am I on at all?
You're on. We can hear you, Chuck.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to have to leave in just a few minutes, but just a couple of things. I've already said my piece, but first of all, I want to say to David Sapp, when our family moved to Richmond when I was teaching at BTSR, we joined Derbyshire. We could not have wished for a better pastor than David. And I'm sitting here now thinking, I didn't even realize, David, that you were going through that conflict, and how badly I feel that, to my knowledge, I didn't reach out to you, and that's, and I apologize for that, because you were such a pastor to our family. But one of the things,
Not
Paul,
necessary.
yeah, Paul, yeah, I think you've heard from those of us who are here about what we can do. I believe we could put together the qualities. I don't want to say of a successful minister, but of a faithful minister. What are the qualities of a faithful minister? And I think the qualities obviously are here in the group. Pastoral, being a good pastor to people, maybe not at the level of Wade, but at least having empathy and care, being able to manage conflict. One of the things that obviously concerns me is that I'm convinced one of the reasons that we are going through the problems that we have at Faith right now is, for all of his wonderful attributes, William was not a good, effective, in my opinion, an effective preacher. But I'm sitting out there, and I don't think this is just my opinion. I'm sitting out there thinking, this thing is not going to continue unless there is an effective presentation from the pulpit.
Yep.
And effective worship, however that's done in jeans, robe, or suits. There's got to be something there for people, or they won't come back. I mean, if they feel like the pastor is not aware of what is going on in their lives and has the empathy and the care and the ability to try to speak to those things. Our pastor did go for a year, for one of those year or two things with CBF, for new pastors.
Yep.
He came back and he asked for a committee to be formed. I was on the committee. The person who is running the committee is a wonderful person, but her father was a pastor, and the last thing that she wanted was for William to be hurt.
Oh dear.
And so the way that these meetings would go is, instead of her taking charge, is it would begin by, William, what do you want to talk about? And usually it was something like, where have you seen God lately? Or some esoteric kind of question like that, rather than something that dealt with what William may have needed. And the emphasis is so much on support that, in retrospect, we did a profound disservice to William. I think in a caring, loving way, there are these young pastors who are out there, and it's not that many of them are very effective preachers, but they have other things. We just had a woman at Highland Baptist, Mary Alice Birdwhistle,
Yes.
who probably was as effective a preacher
Yes, she's great.
I've ever heard, but she ran into all of the other things that a pastorate entailed, such as raising money, such as the business side of the church.
Yep.
And frankly, for her strong gift was in preaching. But I don't know a pastor who can go to a church and say, call me on Sunday, I'll come preach for you, and then disappear. I mean, or say she didn't disappear, but that was just not her. I think her, and I look back at that and I think, gosh, she was so moving when I listened to her. She was so powerful. She had such sterling gifts of connecting with people.
Mm-hmm.
Could there have been some intervention at some point of somebody talking with her and saying, how can we take some of the load off of you on this so that we don't lose you? I mean, not that we've lost her. She'll do, I'm sure, speaking engagement. She's going to speak at Faith, but she's not going to be the pastor at Highland. And frankly, Diane and I would find ourselves often on Sundays worshiping by computer at Highland because she was so effective. And I think there's just a plethora of things that a minister has to do. Now, whether they're coming out of the seminary prepared for that, and whether there's some way we can buttress these people. I don't think it's just peer groups, because ours was in a peer group. And what happens is you get the peer group of people who are about the same age, who come through the same, and so they're sharing, they're sharing the problems that they're having in their churches. And without moving to, okay, how do we begin to approach dealing with this in a positive way, so probably all of that is rambling, but I just have a deep concern, about how do we support pastors during this time when they're coming out, they're lonely, they've been isolated, as you say, because so much is distance learning. I weep at William, who leaves without a place to go, and just think, what could I have done?
Yeah. You've spoken really powerfully about two very different people and two very different transitions, where both pastors left with no next call. And if those aren't alarms for the larger community, then we aren't paying attention.
Yeah.
And I think Mary Alice and William couldn't be any more different than any two human beings you could assemble. But in very different ways, they illustrate the conversation we've been having today.
One of the things I would point out is that, especially younger seminary students, I found they weren't ready to talk about or learn about conflict management. They were interested in getting the Bible down and getting preaching down, getting theology down. And so things that they really needed to know for day-to-day stuff, they perhaps got a light vaccination of that.
Yes.
So it seems to me that the schools and CBF and whoever need to find a way to make these students in 3 to 4 years, sometime out of the seminary, to now come back and let's learn how to handle, or let's talk about managing conflict and managing friendship and managing management.
Yes.
So our system doesn't provide for that easily,
No.
but they definitely get out and in a few years realize they didn't learn this in the seminary. And sometimes they didn't remember it being taught.
That's right. Sometimes it was taught and they didn't remember.
I have the perfect, I get to thinking and I think of these ideal things. So here's my plan. The new pastor comes and on the first Sunday he or she preaches, they have a paper where they have outlined how we're going to handle conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And you pass it out among the congregation and you get everybody, keep it fun, get everybody to vote that they got one of these. And then train people, your leadership in that, and actually follow through on this. I used to teach, one of my ideas was that when people joined your church, they agreed when time came for them to leave, whether it was on a friendly basis or not, as a member of the church, they agreed to meet with a deacon and another person, or a deacon of their choice, and another person or two, and say, here's why we're leaving. And if it's something to rejoice over, you rejoice. If it's a stumbling block that they found, you deal with that, apologize if you need to, and so forth. That's just my idyllic thinking relative to this issue.
Thank you.
So I can sit up here on my 3rd floor and come up with all sorts of.
I have a question that is a little off track from the direction of our conversation, but I'm wondering, Paul, are we getting new churches involved in CBF? And if so, what's their profile? What do they look like?
So we are starting to see new churches come. By and large, they are less likely to be in the southeastern United States. But that's not entirely, if they are in the southeastern United States. So I preached last fall in 2 new CBF congregations that are large established Black congregations that are both in Eastern North Carolina, both who are affiliating with CBF in addition to the General Baptist Convention in North Carolina and the Lock Carey Foreign Mission Convention. I preached last spring in Louisville at St. Stephen's. So we're starting to see a certain kind of historically Black congregation coming to CBF. That's been fascinating to watch. If you've been at General Assembly in the last several years, you know that the number of native Spanish speakers and Latino congregations is growing in CBF. So that's one of the reasons that we are now more racially and ethnically diverse. Sometimes I'm asked the question, are we done with dual alignment? Well, we have fewer congregations dually aligned SBCBF than we ever have. But we are growing in spaces where we're dually aligning with American Baptists. So in the Northeast, in the Mid-Atlantic, in the Heartland, in places in the West, we're seeing congregations come to us seeking a very different kind of Baptist denominational partner than ABC. Not usually instead of ABC, but usually alongside ABC. Because theologically, we and ABC are fairly similar, but culturally, we're very different. And so those are some examples of the kind of spaces. We now got 4 or 5 congregations in Puerto Rico that are dually aligned with us and the Baptist churches of Puerto Rico. So those are some examples of where I'm always asked, are we getting congregations from the SBC in light of their latest discoveries about the SBC having power issues? I'm not aware of any congregations that were solely affiliated SBC who are now all of a sudden CBF.
Sure.
I do know over the last year or two, after Mike Law started his strategy in Northern Virginia, the number of churches dually aligned CBF SBC has dramatically decreased. There's still plenty of them, but the number of those churches that were majority CBF that gave the opportunity to entirely cut ties with the SBC, that was a noticeable trend. So those are some observations about the kind of growth we're seeing, the kind of congregations that seem to be drawn to our fellowship. I will tell you, it's a really interesting thing to go meet with a denominational relations committee of a church that is not of Southern Baptist heritage and talk about who CBF is called to be. Interesting in a really good way, because these people, and it is true talking to younger Baptists who were born, in the 1990s or after, they didn't grow up as part of the story that differently shaped all of us in this call. And, you want to hold on to some of that founding story because our founding was a statement of bold, courageous faith. But you also want to recognize that now more and more people in our space every year were not part of that season. And so what do you hold on to? How are we being made new? I mean, that's an interesting question wrapped up in the CBF's growth toward the future. I'll never forget, Chuck, when you and I served together at BTSR, we were both on the committee that planned the 15th anniversary celebration for the seminary. Chuck chaired it. I got to be on it. And there were 2 famous speakers at the 15th anniversary celebration. Chuck, you remember who they were, right? We had Roy Honeycutt, who admitted in public in our banquet hall that if he'd hired lawyers sooner, he could have saved Southern. That was the news story. The other speaker was Dan Aylshire, who laid upon the seminary the challenge: you could be well-founded as a protest organization, but you couldn't live forever as one. And I think CBF in the last 10 years especially has been trying to figure out, how do we hold our convictional center while being less reactive to the Southern Baptist Convention and more professional, proactive, confessional about a positive identity for who we're called to be in the world. So those words spoken at the midpoint of BTSR's life, I think are really interestingly informative for where we are today.
It is 4:30. Do we have need to go further? Okay. Paul, thank you a lot.
Thank you all so much.
We are frankly disappointed that we aren't, that we're kind of dribbling out here. This is the next to the last program we'll have. But we understand that's reality for us. So we are celebrating the life of this organization, but putting it to bed. And we will have one more program with Baptist Women in Ministry.
Good.
And so I'm hoping we can whip up a little attention there. And then I'm gonna turn over our email mailing list to those women and tell them to try to get some money from us or something.
Good idea.
But anyway, that will then end this. What are you aware of what the original purpose of this organization was?
I don't know the original purpose. No.
There was some big wheels, like the president at Belmont and president of Sunday School Board, who organized secretly to give Roy some money under the table to let him put it onto the war. And this was very hard to get in this organization. I had to wait a year.
Wow.
Before I was voted on and approved. Now we've been begging people. So we've gone through our own evolution, and and those of us who've tried to lead it have stood about all we can. So we're getting out of here.
Well,
but
I'm glad I got to be with you before you shut down.
Well, you were very helpful, and I think you heard some things that I know are in your mind.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Glad to be with y'all. Y'all have a wonderful day.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you so much for today and for your continued leadership, Paul.
Thank
Here,
you.
here.
Yes, sir.
Good to be with you all.
We're for you.
See you.